Hi, this is Ken Adams. Welcome to this edition of the Valley View. And joining me this week is Alan Zundel, who's running for Secretary of State with the Pacific Green Party. So welcome to the show, Alan.
Thank you, Ken.
So what possessed you to decide to run for Secretary of State? Was this a party decision, or was this something where you kind of stepped up and said you'd be willing to do it?
Well, there's a little both. Being active in the party over the last year and preparing for the upcoming elections, I kept saying we need somebody to run for Secretary of State. So that was my issue to bring forward, because we really need election reform before we can accomplish a lot of other things that are important. So Secretary of State, because they do have a role in elections, I thought was a good office for us to fill. And once I said that, nobody else was stepping forward, so people of course said, well, why don't you step forward? Which led to me doing that.
Well, I've been in that similar situation. So you're talking about election reform, and how would you do that as Secretary of State? What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, a lot of it would be raising the possibilities for different types of elections to the public and using the Secretary of State's office as a platform to do that, okay? And then going to the legislature and bringing a little bit of lobbying into that to say, you know, these are things we could do to fix the kind of problems we're seeing this year with the elections. The two major parties splitting apart, which is something you could see coming for a long time, but because of the election system we have, we're forced to choose in a sense between two parties which are not accommodating people's views very well. So they're splitting at the seams. So I thought there should be a role for independent candidates and third-party candidates, and other election systems allow that to happen. So I want to raise that, make people aware of that, and get the legislature thinking about that. Also, I think voting technology, the certification of vote, the kind of voting machines we have, the vote tabulation machines we have, is something the Secretary of State could do on their own to make sure we have the equipment necessary for some types of different election systems that they use in other democracies.
What kind of systems are you thinking about?
There's a few of them that could be used, but the one that I see as the most feasible and has the least bad effects and the most good effects and solves a lot of problems we have now is ranked choice voting, which is also called instant runoff voting.
You're going to have to explain that, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who have not heard that term before.
Yeah. Well, you would get to rank the candidates for an office in the order of your preference. For example, this is the candidate I most like, this is my second choice as a candidate, and this is my third choice, and so on, as far as you want to go or as far as they give you opportunities to go. I think most people, 3 would be plenty. Then a candidate has to get a majority of the first place votes to win. That's more than half. Right now, people can actually win with less than a majority, which creates the spoiler problem and the rest of the kind of issues that lead people to think alternative candidates aren't viable. So if no candidate gets a majority, then the last place candidate is automatically eliminated, and those votes are transferred to each voter's next choice until somebody gets a majority. So it gives voters a choice to rank candidates. It ensures that the candidate who wins has broad support, has to get a majority, and it also eliminates some of the spoiler issues, allows other candidates to win, which means that people like me running for an alternative party get a hearing. We don't necessarily have to be the best funded or the best known people to get the voters to listen to us, because they can vote for us and still have, in essence, a backup vote.
And one of the outcomes, too, I would think, is that it might help some of these smaller parties, like the Pacific Green Party, Libertarian, and so on, get people registering in their parties, because they wouldn't feel like they were forced into one of the two major parties.
And it also allows people who really like their candidates to vote for them with more of a clear conscience. They don't have to worry about, like this year, people are going to be worrying about, if I vote for somebody other than the two major party candidates, even if I don't like those two a lot, I might be enabling somebody I like even less to win. It takes away that dilemma.
And that is a serious problem, I think, because I think, and this is my opinion, is that the two major parties kind of do that. They kind of try to make people afraid to vote for the other candidate, to kind of keep people in line with their particular views, even though they might not be the best representative for that individual voter.
We have two very unpopular presidential candidates who are going to be the nominees. And people are afraid to vote for candidates. They like my party's candidate for president is Jill Stein. And she's appealing to a lot of people that supported Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primaries. But some of them are already raising concerns that a vote for Jill Stein would be, in effect, a vote for Donald Trump. I don't think that's entirely true because the Electoral College and the role it plays in elections, but that fear is there.
And it's something that's come up during past elections, too,
Oh, yeah.
like the 2000 election.
I hear about that all the time.
Yes. so that would somewhat alleviate that.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of other democratic countries use a parliamentary system.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you get, say, 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the representatives.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a bar that you have to reach, say, like 5%. You have to get at least 5% of the vote to get a representative. But then at least you have people in the parliament or Congress or whatever you want to call it that represent that particular party. And quite often coalitions will form if, you know, somebody doesn't get a majority vote.
Right.
But what you're talking about, this ranking, somebody would always have to have a majority of voters voting for them in essence.
It's not as favorable to alternative parties as proportional representation, which you're talking about, but I think it's more politically feasible to do ranked choice voting here simply because doing proportional representation takes away the geographic districts that we're so used to. Be a major overhaul of the election laws as opposed to one that would be a more simple modification. It does create a fairer playing field for alternative parties. It doesn't give them any kind of advantage over the two parties that are the dominating parties, because those parties would still have the most money, the most name recognition, you know, established voter bases, all that. So if a third party were to overcome those things, it would take a little time. But I think it'd be fairer than what we have now.
So what are some of the other things the Secretary of State can do? I know that sometimes the major parties are always trying to bump the smaller parties off the ballot, and that's been an issue in various states.
Yeah.
And so I would imagine that you would try to make sure that it was a more open process for the smaller parties to get on the ballot.
Oregon is not as bad as a lot of other states. There's some pretty bad states out there. But it is very difficult for third parties to maintain a ballot line. And like we have to get a certain percentage of the vote, even though the election system is stacked against us getting any vote. And we have to do it on a statewide level, which means that we have to run candidates for the highest offices statewide, even though we don't have the kind of financial resources that's necessary to do that, like my candidacy. Part of the reason I'm running is simply because we need to get a certain level of votes to maintain our ballot line. I think that could be changed. You could make things easier by lowering thresholds and doing some other things like that.
Now, actually, in Oregon, they have a third major party.
Yeah, the independent
party,
sure.
which is very unusual.
It is. It's a very unusual party, too.
Yeah. Yes, I would say that was true. So what are some of the other duties of the Secretary of State that people might not be as familiar with, but it has a big impact on not just the elections, but businesses as well?
Yeah. It's an administrative position primarily, but depending on who the secretary is, they could do more or less with their position to try to make changes in policy. Some of the main things they do, one of them is they keep the corporate registry of businesses. And we've got a fairly new category for businesses, which is the public benefit corporations. They put environmental and social goals on equal plane with profit seeking. And I think that's really, you know, where the future should be as far as business practices are concerned. So the secretary could make use of the records of those public benefit corporations to find out what their needs are, what challenges they face, and make sure they have an easier road to operating a business in this state. There's also the small business, it's like an ombudsman where they assist small businesses to navigate the governmental system. And I think they should be reaching out as well to small businesses, but also to the public benefit corporations as well.
to try to help them navigate through the bureaucracy of the state government.
Yeah, because the system is primarily set up for for-profit corporations, the ones that we're used to, and being anything other than that, whether it's a cooperative or it's a public benefit corporation or it's a small business, it's hard to navigate that system.
So that's one of the things then that you would like to put on your
Yes.
agenda if you were elected Secretary of State. What are some of the other things that people might not be so familiar
Okay,
with?
they're in charge of public records, and they can make it harder or easier for the media or for the public to access those public records. I would be very strongly on the side of making access as easy as possible.
So like FOIA type request would be easier
Yes,
to get.
Freedom of Information Act. I don't think we should have to go to the extent of having a lawsuit to get information from the government about what they're actually doing. It should be the default position of the government that if citizens want to know something about what's going on, they should tell them. I mean, maybe at the federal level, you can make a case for foreign policy, war decisions, things like that. But at the state level, what do we have to hide?
Well, that's a good question. And, we saw some of that with the last governor, is that people had questions about what exactly was going on.
Yeah.
And it did end up in court about releasing emails or not to release emails.
Yeah, I think a mindset can set in, not saying anything about the governor or his fiance, but in general, mindset can be us against them when it comes to the government and the public. I'm, spent most of my life as a member of the public. I'm not a career politician. I used to be a political scientist, which is why I got concerned about the kind of issues that are not being addressed. So my bias is towards letting the people know. They can't
give them
make
the
good choices
information
they
to
don't know.
make a good decision. About
Right, they need to know what's going on. What is the government doing in your name?
And that's quite often a issue even at local government.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen plenty of that here in Salem
Yeah.
as well. But what are some of the issues then? You were kind of alluding to the fact that a lot of the issues as a political scientist you didn't see being addressed. What
Yeah.
are some of those issues that you think need to be addressed that aren't being addressed?
Well, the big three right now, they're being addressed to some extent, but not in the way I and probably other people would like to see them being addressed. One is the economy. In the 1970s, our economy started shifting in a really profoundly fundamental way. We were losing a lot of jobs and incomes were starting to diverge. Working people were not making as much. Their wages were stagnant, and they've been stagnant for decades, where the people at the top of the pile, the major executives of large corporations and some of the shareholders are making lots of money. So I saw that starting to happen when I was a professor, and I didn't think either the Republican agenda of just taking away all government regulation and taking away labor unions and things like that was a solution, but nor did I think the Democrats' proposed solution they really had two. One was move towards the Republicans and adopt some of their agenda. Centrists like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton adopted that program. But the other direction was, let's try to go back to the New Deal, which to me reflects a lot more what Bernie Sanders was saying. I'd rather go back to the New Deal than head towards the Republicans' direction, but I think we need new ideas because the economy is changing. Our politics and our ways of approaching the economy should change. So that's one, the economy. The other is climate change. That's something that's been around for a while as a concern, but as the years go by, we can see it happening. It's no longer, to me anyway, it's no longer theoretical. We don't just have to trust climate scientists. We can pick up a newspaper and see things happening, and we're really past the point of no return. We can do things now to mitigate it, but we're not doing those things. And I'd like to see the government step up to that and do a lot more than it is doing. And I think part of the reason is because the role of money in politics. Fossil fuel corporations and vested interests are keeping that from happening. The final one is foreign policy and the reliance on force and military power to try to suppress, determine what happens in other countries. Our country is, to some extent, responsible for the creation of Islamic State, but all we hear about is trying to bomb them and,
It
jail
hasn't been
people
very
that talk about it.
effective. It just seems to be making things worse.
It makes more terrorists. I mean,
Yeah.
when you give people more and more reason to distrust our country and feel like we're the bully on the block, they're going to join a movement that says, to me, it smacks of the Vietnam War. There were people in the national independence movement, and we kept coming in and saying, do things our way.
Well, it was interesting because I saw an interview with a CIA analyst, and she would quite often debrief, people who were in Al-Qaeda and ISIS and like that. And she said that they felt like they were fighting the empire. It was a Star Wars kind of, they were in fact mentioning American movies like Star Wars and like that, where a small band of scruffy people are doing whatever they can to stop the empire or whoever. And that's how they saw themselves, as fighting this big empire that was trying to control them. And I do think that, like, especially with the Middle East, that's exactly what you're seeing. The United States is trying to control things by destabilizing governments and then when they destabilize them, like what they did in Iraq, they have all sorts of problems, because then there's nothing to hold the country together, because most of the time the lines were drawn up by the British, after World War I, and they didn't make a lot of sense then, and they certainly don't quite often make a lot of sense today.
Well, obviously the Secretary of State can't do a lot about foreign policy, but what I'd like to see happen is for candidates for the office of president, as well as for the Senate and the House of Representatives, to have to address third-party points of view. When other people raise the kinds of concerns that you just did and that I just did, people should have the opportunity to hear that. But if you just have those major parties getting all the airtime, neither one of them, they're going to blame each other all the time. If we get in office, we'll do better than they did at what isn't working in the first place.
Well, that brings up a good point about, like, the debates, the presidential debates and so on, is that it's limited now. In fact, it's run by the Democrats and Republicans. It's, none of the other parties can get invited or anything else. But I lived in California when Gray Davis was recalled, and they had hundreds of candidates. And when they had their debates, they had usually about 6 or so candidates running, including a Green Party candidate, and various other candidates that were running. And in the debates, they were a lot more lively. There was a lot more discussion about issues because of the fact that they had multiple parties involved in the debates. And they couldn't, and like you said, they couldn't just say, oh, well, that's their fault, pointing the finger at the other person. They had to come up with actual kind of solutions then, or views of how to get past a certain problem.
Yeah, and bring up things that other parties may not want to talk about. We need more lively debates. We need debates that are informative rather than debates, so-called debates, which engage in personal attacks and comparing the size of hands and silly things like that.
Well, yes. And I avoided that for the most part. I just thought that it was more like showmanship. It didn't have anything to do quite often with issues.
What you mentioned earlier about the presidential debates, I don't think a lot of people are aware that the commission that sponsors these is run by the Democrats and Republicans. And they have actively colluded in the past to exclude other candidates, such as Ralph Nader when he ran. They don't like to see competing points of views aired. It's no longer run. It used to be run by the League of Women Voters, which is truly nonpartisan, not bipartisan. Bipartisan means just 2 parties get to make the decision.
Yeah, and that's what's happened over the last several presidential elections. It's sponsored by Budweiser and companies like that. And I don't think it's, we get into this situation, I think, that quite often, and you kind of alluded to it, that money is determining who the candidates are. And I used to say that the real presidential election was like the year before, when people were collecting money to see if they were actually viable candidates, not their ideas or anything else, but how much money they could raise. Of course, it didn't work too well for Jeb Bush this last time. He raised an awful lot of money, and it didn't help him.
It's not the determinative factor in who wins, but it is a determinative factor in who gets taken seriously. Political scientists actually had a term for this. They called it the invisible primary. If you couldn't raise money, you weren't going to even get into the national discourse in the first place. So your ability to raise money gave you the opportunity to be heard.
And on those issues that you say aren't being discussed in any kind of real detail, like climate change, our foreign policy issues, and
The economy.
the economy, when those issues are brought up, they're quite often not brought up as the main issues even.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the important ones that affects people's lives.
I think they are, yeah.
And
There's a lot of important issues, but your ability to live safely and earn a living and have a meaningful life is pretty fundamental, right? And the economy threatens that, terrorism threatens that, and climate change threatens that. You know, those are fundamental.
And you know, you were pointing out that workers' wages have been basically frozen since the late 70s.
Yeah.
And that, you know, if you look at it in constant dollars, that is exactly what has happened. And in fact, since the 2007-8 kind of recession, workers' wages are still below what they were at that time, for the most part. And a lot of that is because manufacturing jobs, which were usually good-paying jobs, aren't here in the United States anymore. We're talking about Walmart and those kinds of jobs, and like in IT, you get a lot of high-paying things, but I don't know what exactly you're building for, because like Apple, you know, the actual phone that you're using or computer you're using is made someplace else.
Right.
And so those good-paying jobs aren't here anymore.
Yeah.
And it also then, it makes me worry too, because I know one of the things that Jill Stein talked about was student debt. And finding a good-paying job, even with a college education, is not an easy thing. And now you're saddled with a bunch of debt. And maybe you're working at Starbucks because that's the only job you can get.
Yeah. There's a connecting thread to a lot of this. Just take student debt. Similar to the housing crisis and to credit card loans, the investment community has turned towards financialization, which essentially means trying to extract more from people who need money by giving them loans at high interest rates rather than investing in profitable enterprises. Part of that is because it's harder and harder to find profitable opportunities because of globalization and competition on a worldwide level. And part of it is because consumers don't have the money to spend as much anymore. So trying to get money by lending money and putting people more and more in debt, put their future in mortgage, is part of what's happening in the economy. But those connections aren't always made.
And then it does create a crisis, because we have a shrinking middle class. We have a lot of people falling out of the middle class, and we see that homeless situation, which I can remember back in the early 80s. I was living in a town of about 50,000, and there was one homeless person. And I was talking to somebody recently, and they can't even count all the homeless people they have now.
Yeah, it's one sign of what's happening. Yeah.
And that's an example of what's been going on. And you know, you can look at the economy overall, and there are people making a lot of money, and you know, certain professions you can do okay. But I mean, for the working class, what we used to call blue-collar workers, it has been a really bad 30, 40 years.
And for young people, it's pretty scary.
Yeah, because they can't even get in sometimes. And so I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people had expectations with Bernie Sanders running in the Democratic Party, because they saw things being done differently.
Yeah, he talked in a different way. He was more honest about some of the things we've been papering over.
And so now people don't have, in the two major parties, any place to vote for if they want to see those things followed through. And I think one of the dangers there is that people will think, well, there's nothing there for me to vote for, which means a lower turnout.
It could. You do have to give them a different vision and make a plausible case that there's other things that can be done, and that's one of the things that Bernie did. He said, we can go farther on a lot of these things. One of the things that's kind of getting lost in the background is that the 2008 crash showed that there's something fundamentally wrong with the economy. And it was more or less billions of dollars pumped into the economy by the government, the creation of new money that saved the banks and saved the financial system. The problems haven't been corrected. We just kind of dumped money into the system to keep it running in hopes that somehow things would correct themselves. Reform on Wall Street, one of the things Bernie talked about, hasn't been addressed very well, both in this past Obama administration and probably in any future administration. Wall Street seems to be sacrosanct.
Well, because that's where the money comes from
That's where
to
the
run
money-
for election.
Right, campaign funds.
So,
I think it's more than that, actually. I think people who get into high levels of power become very comfortable with people in other positions of power, and they start to see the world in the same way.
yes. You can, I think that's what you see kind of at all levels of government, too, is that people that are, you know, I always find it amazing that somebody's running for city council that pays no money, requires an awful lot of reading and preparation for your city council meetings, and you spend $20,000 to get elected. I mean,
On a salary like that.
well, yes, and so it always boggles me as to, you know, how that plays out for an individual. You're taking on all this extra work for no money. In fact, you're spending a lot of money to get that.
Right. You gotta spend a
So
lot
there's
of money.
something else going on there, as opposed to, you know, just civic service.
Who can afford to run for office?
Who can afford to spend $20,000 on running for a city council position?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And it goes right down the line. If you don't have the money, it's hard to get much traction in this. People got jobs. You know, I'm semi-retired, so I have the time to do this. Otherwise, how would I even run for an office?
Well, and that's, I think, the situation for most folks. Even though, and not only that, but, you know, the work week is kind of long.
It's getting longer for people who actually have jobs.
Yes, it is. And so, like, when they're finished working, they're done. And it doesn't give them an opportunity to be civically involved or even to follow.
It's hard to follow, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially with the media the way it is. You don't
Well,
get a lot of good information.
Yeah, and I mean, in a town even this size, they don't cover what's going on really in city government that well.
Yeah, newspapers aren't doing too well.
Well, they lost a lot of their advertising.
Yeah, internet, and that's another big game changer in the economy is internet companies and how it's shaking everything up.
So if people are interested in finding out more about your campaign,
Yeah,
how do they
I
do
hope
that?
so.
How do they find
Best
out?
place to go is my website, voteforalan.org, and that's Alan, A-L-A-N, so VOTEFORALAN.org.
Okay. And I want to thank you, Alan, for dropping by and
thank you.
talking a little bit about an office that I think a lot of people don't really understand what goes on.
That's probably true, yeah.
And so this has been Valley View, and thank you for watching.